Hi, this is Remembering the Past, the show where we talk about people who've died recently who've had a profound effect on our history, our society, or our culture. Tonight we're going to talk about one of the most talented and yet one of the most unfortunate stars of our generation, Anna Marie Pierce, aka Patty Duke, who died recently at the age of 69. There were very few actresses ever that were as good and as well loved by audiences as Patty Duke, and yet her greatest legacy probably has nothing to do with her acting. It has to do with her work on behalf of mental illness. You don't get many childhoods tougher than Patty Duke's. At a young age, her parents were dysfunctional and gave her over to two talent agents, John and Ethel Ross, who recognized they had a once-in-a-lifetime talent in Patty. Unfortunately, besides grooming her talent, they abused her in every way. They changed her name from Anna Marie Duke to Patty Duke, and all the while they were training her and building a stable of acting credits, they were exploiting her. When she was 12, she was in a television soap opera, and then in the television version of Meet Me in St. Louis with Ed Wynn. While she was rehearsing for her most famous role, she was on the quiz show $64,000 Question. She won $32,000, but it was later discovered that she'd been fed answers, and here she talks about that, including testifying before Congress.
Eddie Hodges, who was a young actor at the time, and I challenged each other for $64,000. I wound up going to the Congress because we were given the answers. When I first went to the Congress and I testified, I lied. And when I finished my testimony, I want to think it's a Southern senator that's in my ear, said, "Now, Anne Marie, have you told us the truth?" "No, sir." And I spilled my guts. It was very traumatic for the Rosses and me. I was opening in The Miracle Worker a week later. And so the bad publicity was very troublesome to them. It was a gradual process. You would go to an office, the production office, and they would say, maybe you should pay attention to X, and my category was music, to some country music, What do you know about country music? Nothing. I knew I had to do country music, and they would narrow it down. It's amazing what they went through. Each meeting, they would narrow it down until you got, just before the show, the answers. There were a number of people involved, and sadly, I don't remember their names. I'm very good at blocking things like that out. Everybody needed a job, and that's how they justified it. The Rosses said, "You knew nothing, you saw nothing, they said nothing, your mother didn't know anything, we didn't know anything." And that's what I testified to. Until I couldn't. Occasionally it was brought up through the years because it's interesting. You put two little kids in booths and you make them lie. Or you coach them to lie.
Well, you heard her talk about how when that was going on in 1959, she was trying out for The Miracle Worker, and that was her first major starring role. She played a young Helen Keller with Anne Bancroft as Annie Sullivan in the Broadway play. The play ran for nearly 2 years, from October of 59 to July of 61, and about midway through the production run, Patty's name was placed above the title on the marquee. It's one of the iconic performances ever on Broadway. And then in 1962, it was made into a film, and Anne Bancroft and Patty Duke reprised their roles. Remember, she's only 16 years old here. Anne Bancroft is superb, Patty Duke is superb, and the scene where Annie Sullivan teaches Helen Keller to say water for the first time is one of the most historic scenes in movies.
W-A-T-E-R, water. It has a name. W-A-T. Whoa. 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 Yes. Yes. Oh, my dear. Ground.
Both Anne Bancroft and Patty Duke won Academy Awards there. Anne Bancroft for Best Actress, Patty Duke for Best Supporting Actress. At the time, Patty Duke was the youngest Academy Award winner ever in a competitive category. She held that title for 11 more years until Tatum O'Neal broke it. Here is the presentation to her that night.
The winner of last year's award for Best Supporting Actor in West Side Story, Mr. George Shakiris. George?
For Best Performance by an Actress in a Supporting Role, those nominated are Mary Badham in To Kill a Mockingbird, Patty Duke in The Miracle Worker, Shirley Knight in Sweet Bird of Youth, Angela Lansbury in The Manchurian Candidate, and Thelma Ritter in Birdman of Alcatraz. The winner is Patty Duke in The Miracle Worker.
Thank you.
Hey, you beat out Angela Lansbury in The Manchurian Candidate. You've done something. By the way, you'll remember a couple of weeks back we did the George Kennedy podcast, and she presented the award to him a couple years later. Again, she's still 16 years old here, and she's one of the top stars in the world. During this time, she's in a major television production of Graham Greene's The Power and the Glory with two guys named Laurence Olivier and George C. Scott. But if you're not into that highbrow stuff, you know Patty Duke for another reason. In 1963, Sidney Sheldon, who was a real genius, and we talked about him, we've talked about I Dream of Jeannie and Larry Hagman, got a hold of her and decided to put her in a new series he had an idea for, and he wanted to call it The Patty Duke Show. She would also be the youngest star ever to have a television series named after her. Here she talks about the show that every baby boomer girl grew up with.
ABC was interested in doing a show with me called The Patty Duke Show. Sidney Sheldon and Peter Lawford and Bill Asher were the producers, and Sidney wrote it. He asked that I spend a week or so with his family and him so that he could get a kind of an idea, because nobody knew what the show was going to be. It was just the Patty Duke Show. So I spent the week, and it was wonderful. They had a big, glamorous house, and they were gracious and kind, and the food was great. And after I left, I think it was about 2 or 3 weeks later, Sidney decided that he wanted both sides of my personality to be represented. And that's how he invented identical cousins. And I didn't know how I would do it. I knew eventually that they were not going to be two whole people. In order to create one, I had to take away from the other, or add to Patty, let's say, energy to Patty that Kathy didn't have. That was the best device I could come up with to make them different. Kathy came from general Europe. At first she was supposed to come from Scotland, and I did the Scottish accent so well they couldn't understand me. So they made it a general whatever. She came to live with Patty and the rest of the Lane family, a mother, father, brother, and boyfriend, Eddie Applegate. They would trade places, play tricks on people, use each other to get out of scams that they would, mostly Patty would invent. Kathy was my favorite because she was calm and sedate and spoke nicely. I liked the earnestness of her. She seemed more mature. And remember, I was getting older, and I wanted my maturity to be respected. I didn't like Patty. She embarrassed me. It definitely evolved, and Bill Asher was incredibly helpful. He had worked with Lucy for years. He even stole a scene from Lucy to have me do. And I didn't do it nearly as well as she did. But that show had something that I don't think shows have had until now, maybe Modern Family. That family had a father and a mother who were the head of the household. These kids may have played these pranks and all that, but there were consequences. And there was a wonderful relationship between Patty and her father. He was usually the one passing down the wisdom or passing down the consequence.
Her father and mother, by the way, were fresh off Dobie Gillis. Her father was William Shallard, who was Professor Pomfret on Dobie Gillis, and her mother was Jean Byron, who was Professor Imogene Burkhart in Dobie Gillis, and of course her real name was Imogene Burkhart. Here's Patty singing one of the big hits of the day on The Patty Duke Show.
Entering the ice I am, entering the ice I am, I got married to the widow next door. She's been married 7 times before, and everyone was an entering. She wouldn't have a willy or a sock. I'm a right old man, I'm entering the ice I am.
I mean, how many people could play Helen Keller and do that? The irony is she did not have much of a personal life. She played a typical American teenager, but she was anything but. She complained that she never got to listen to rock and roll. And yet in 1965, she had a major rock and roll hit. Here's Jimmy O'Neill, whose podcast we've done, introducing her on Shindig.
You're about to meet the youngest artist ever to star on Broadway or win an Oscar for Best Supporting Actress. And as if that weren't enough, she's the star of her own weekly television series. So after all that, does she rest on her laurels? No chance. Here she is tonight on Shindig, launching a whole new phase of her career as a singer and a recording artist. Now, I got a hunch it's going to pay big dividends in the form of a hit record with her very first song entitled Don't Just Stand There. So I won't. Instead, I'll introduce you to the star of The Patty Duke Show. Ladies and gentlemen, the one and only Miss Patty Duke.
Please don't just stand there, come and kiss like before. Please don't just stand there, looking down at the floor. It's something wrong. Give me just one little sign. Tell me what's on your mind?
This was taking a tremendous toll on her. I've heard The Patty Duke Show was one of the last 60 sitcoms filmed in New York, so they could take advantage of the looser child labor laws because she had to do so much playing 2 characters. In any event, her career changed in 1967 when she was in Valley of the Dolls. And it was an adult role for this child film star. People had trouble getting used to it, and the irony is she was playing a character based on Judy Garland, another incredible talent who they burned out. And in fact, the director was a jerk, kicked Judy Garland off the set. Patty Duke did a bunch of other stuff, but I want to mention one other movie, and it doesn't get much publicity. It was a 1969 film called Me, Natalie, where she played a young girl from Brooklyn. She's looking for love, and she meets a lot of bad men. And she goes to a psychedelic dance, and one of the men she meets had a very, very brief debut in this film. This is his first role. See if you can guess who it is.
My name is You dancing or taking a tour?
I'm dancing. What do you think? Come on. You have a nice body, you know that?
You think so?
Yeah.
Look at my name.
Listen. Do you put out?
You mean at least?
What do you mean? Do you put out or don't you?
No.
I don't know what I'm doing talking to you. Somebody like you ought to be asking me.
Yeah, 3 years later, that guy's in The Godfather playing Michael Corleone. That was Al Pacino's film debut. I reviewed that movie, by the way, for my high school newspaper. I called Patty Duke Tough But Tender. I think I ripped that off from some New York movie magazine. Well, I don't like to touch on this stuff, but I think in Patty Duke's case, we have to. In 1982, she was diagnosed with manic depression, now called bipolar disorder, and she wrote about it in her 1987 autobiography, Call Me Anna. She reverted back to her older name. And that was a very courageous thing to do. It was a huge risk to her career. But you know what? This was more important to her than her career. She lobbied Congress for more funding for mental illness. That was her first foray since the 50s. She worked with the National Institutes of Mental Health. And her whole purpose at this point was to destigmatize bipolar disorder and other mental illnesses which had taken their toll on her life. And she really did a wonderful job with that, and that should be an important part of her legacy. Our Patty Duke trivia is that her son is Sean Astin, who was in Lord of the Rings. She was married for a while to John Astin, Gomez Addams in the Addams Family, but DNA testing proved that John Astin wasn't really his father. For a while, I thought it was Desi Arnaz Jr., but it wasn't his son either. In any event, with medication and therapy, Patty Duke settled down to a pretty normal but productive life. Well, I'm going to close on that note. I want to thank my producer and IT genius, Sid Taps, and we're going to close with one of the iconic TV themes. The theme from The Patty Duke Show called Cousins, music by Sid Raymond, a great Broadway composer, lyrics by Bob Wells. A happier time for us, maybe not such a happy time for Patty.
We've cabins live most everywhere, from Zanzibar to Berkeley Square.
But Patty's always seen the sights a girl can see from Brooklyn Heights. Our Patty loves to rock and roll, a hot dog makes her lose control. What a crazy pair, they're cousins, identical cousins all the way. One pair of matching bookends,
Life